also honored to be here with Fred Moffett, my old friend. I think about 80 or 90% of what I know about 19th century and early 20th century art in Knoxville, I know from one essay that Fred wrote in a book. I think you can still get the Heart of the Valley, which is I think the best single primer to the history of art in Knoxville. Knoxville, of course, is not known for visual art, and especially the 19th century Knoxville was not known for it. And even though it was known for a few other things like literature, there are significant writers and a few interesting musicians who lived in Knoxville in the 19th century, but not as many artists that are famous anyway. And I wanted to talk about why that might be, and just give a little backstory, and then talk about the early blooming of the artistic movement here. Knoxville, of course, was founded on the frontier, was the original territorial capital and then state capital of Tennessee, but then later kind of lost its economic raison d'etre in a way in the mid-19th century, and it was a city that had a past but not necessarily a future. But it suddenly, in the mid-19th century, when it got railroads and industry, there was suddenly a great deal of interest in the city, a lot of new people here, and different ways of looking at things. One of the reasons that Knoxville was not very artistic in its early days was that it was a fairly practical place that where people were interested in making money and not just surviving. But also it was a strongly Protestant city that we didn't even have the kind of funeral art that you find in graveyards, because the early Presbyterians who lived here, if you look at the Presbyterian graveyard downtown, there are no statues of it, there's only one cross, which is from a much later era than the actual active period of graveyard. They believe that even crosses were graven images, so the stones are very plain. Some of them have a little bit of inscription on them, like there's a couple of willow trees and things like that, but that's about the extent of even that kind of practical art in the early days. But in the mid-19th century, you see a lot of influx of immigrants, including Catholics, who I think embarrassed the Presbyterians into start rethinking the idea of funeral art. But when the Catholics started putting in these great statues and things at Calvary Cemetery in East Knoxville, which is an interesting place to walk around if you haven't seen it, and also Old Gray Cemetery, which is a sculpture garden of its own. This was one kind of art that started coming in. But as I mentioned, the city even during this time was not strictly practical. There were great practitioners of the rhetorical arts here. I think like Parson Brown, who was there were great experts in using words to make an argument and to make people laugh, which he was good at. And also George Washington Harris, an early writer, who was some national consequence here in town. But and then there were also people interested in music. Some of the early German immigrants brought this idea of music with them. In the 1860s, we had an orchestra leader named Gustav Knabe, who had worked with Mendelssohn and other people in Germany before he came over. So he was a guy that inspired the very first orchestral groups here in town as early as the 1860s. But very little in terms of painting. There was a flowering, as I mentioned, this economic boost just before the Civil War. The time that we were bringing in railroads, the time that we built Market Square, the time that the School for the Deaf was built, which was kind of a big deal at the time. There was a great deal of interest in a lot of different aspects of culture, including art, and there was a very short-lived group called the East Tennessee Arts Association, which was associated with a painter named Samuel Schaefer, who was our best-known, I guess, mid-19th century portrait artist. And there's some lovely work of his in the McClellan collection downtown. If you haven't seen it, but he did a beautiful picture of Perez Dickinson. In fact, a cousin of Emily Dickinson, the poet. Perez Dickinson was one of the titans of business in Knoxville in the 19th century, and he hired Samuel Schaefer to paint a large portrait of his deceased wife, his wife who died only about a year after they were married. And there's a wonderful portrait of her in the McClellan collection, very high up on the wall, with a picture of their house in the background. The Civil War ended a whole lot of things. It ended ended that early brief flourishing, if you can call it that, of arts movement. Samuel Shaver moved away, and the Civil War brought with it its own need for art. Its own people wanted to commemorate the war in different ways, and brought into that scene stepped a guy named Lloyd Ransom from Union County. Fred's going to talk more about him later. But the story is that he was a very young man when when someone noticed that he made a sketch of General Grant, who was in town in 1863-64, and Ransom made a sketch of it that was apparently very impressive and convinced some people that he should be sent away to art school to work on his craft. He came back and became the most celebrated artist, I guess, in the late 19th century. He did most of his work in portraits, but occasionally did something genuinely artistic, like calling marble, which Fred will talk about later. But around Lloyd Ransom was kind of the central celebrity to an arts movement that began flourishing about 20 years after the Civil War. This was a time when Knoxville was really growing from a has-been town, a former frontier capital, into a genuine city in the years after the war. Knoxville was a town of about something thousand people. Of course, all those 5,000 people lived downtown, so there were times that it seemed urban during the Civil War. But it grew from that size into a city of about 35,000 by the end of the century. So it more than by a multiple, it grew about a multiple of 6, I guess, in that 30 or 40 year period, and had dozens of factories. There were lots of things going on. The city was really humming with a very diverse economy by the 1880s. Had its fingers in all sorts of. We had an iron factory, marble mills, we had lumber, furniture places, we had railroad shops, we had all sorts of textile mills, all sorts of things going on here, but very little culturally. We did have some musical groups, as I mentioned, that Canava's orchestral groups were coming along, and we had early music festivals. And this is interesting and relevant artistically, because I think the first reference I've ever found to an art gallery, arts exhibition in Knoxville was in 1883, and it was part of a music festival, a classical, an opera festival, more or less is what it was. But down the street from the Opera House, they had an art gallery. Unfortunately, people seem very proud of it, that we had an art gallery in Knoxville, but I haven't found a single description of what was in there. And I don't know names of any artists or what kind of work it was or anything. We had an art gallery, and that's all we needed to know. But apparently they went around and culled just from the collections of local people, the things that they were proud of, and probably some of the portraits and things that we see in the McClellan collection and also here. Besides that intriguing little thing, that there's very little evidence of popular interest in art. But in 1885, a group of feminists, in fact, founded a group called the Osprey Circle, which was an educational organization for women, kind of a personal improvement and also political activist organization. I understand it's a little bit different now. It still exists on Kingston Pike, but in the early days, it had a specific motive for empowering young women and exposing them to the world, which many of them had not had much glimpse on at home or in limited education that was available. But also another group the following year called the Irving Club, which was an all-male organization, which was a literary society in which they talked mainly about books. But both organizations talked a great deal about art. I looked at the early minutes of both groups, and they had frequent programs, weekly or monthly programs, which had something to do with art, usually historical art, not necessarily keeping in touch with every new thing, but introducing people to the idea of art as an expression of culture. But out of this came another group, a more specific group about visual art, which was originally called the Knoxville Art Club, founded in the 1890s, and again involving Lloyd Ransom, I guess probably the only professional artist, not counting photographers who were making a living here. Lloyd Ransom was probably the only guy making a living as a painter in Knoxville in the 1880s and 90s. But a woman named Eleanor Swan Audigier was a fairly well-off wife of a guy who was a professor at UT. But she became central to this. I don't know whether she alone started it, but she quickly became central to this group called the Knoxville Art Club, which later became known as the Nicholson Art League, named after their chief benefactor. The Nicholson Art League in the Knoxville Art Club was a fascinating group. It was kind of like a Justice League of America, but just about artists. If you were to name all the best known, the people with any connection to art in the late 19th century, architects, a couple of writers, musicians, all sorts of people. People like George Barber, the architect that is much admired today for his Victorian houses, many of which are still standing in the older parts of town. People like Joseph Naffel, the Austrian immigrant who was a photographer of some note. Other people, I had a whole list of them here at one point, but Lloyd Ransom, of course, Charles Crouch, the Impressionist artist who was a member of this very dynamic German family. It was his nephew, by the way, who established the park downtown. But Charles Crouch was an organist, was an artist with a particular interest in painting mountain scenes of the Smoky Mountains, which at the time were not as accessible as we think of us as actually almost living in the Smokies today. But in the 1880s and 90s, most Knoxvillians had never really been into the mountains. It was hard to get there. The roads were bad, and only you had to be a pretty rugged guy who wanted to do some overnight hiking to really spend time and get into the mountains. And Charles Crouch's landscapes of the mountains were looked at with a great deal of interest because many Knoxvillians had never seen the mountains from such an intimate point of view as Charles Crouch brought back in this period. He became known. He had a reputation as around the region as the Corot of the South. But he was another one of this august group of artists in those days. Another guy who became involved eventually is Hugh Tyler, who was the uncle of a writer named James Agee, and is actually referred to in the novel Death and Family. And he's the artist, the artistic uncle that plays important roles. And Tyler was an uneven but talented artist, and I'm glad that he's represented in this exhibit as well. And Captain Wiley, who literally grew up about two or three blocks away from here, and she became, I think, the star of the Nicholson Art League, and was probably the best known artist from Knoxville before the Second World War, anyway. She was inspired by the Impressionist movement, and I should back up a little bit, actually. The Nicholson Art League in the 1890s and early 1900s was mainly interested in historical art. They referred back to things that used to be, and then they weren't provincial at all. They looked at Egyptian art. They would have a whole month about Egyptian art, and a whole 6 months about Asian art. But it was not. They were not very much interested in the modern until a woman in early 1907 gave a unit on Monet, Degas, and their contemporaries in France, and this was the first inkling that there was a great deal of interest in Impressionism here. But suddenly it flowered. There were more programs about it. There was a great deal of interest in Impressionism in the early 20th century Knoxville, all fairly suddenly after 1907. And Catherine Wiley was the star of this. She's remembered. She went to UT, was known as an artist there, but went away to school, studied up north, and with I'm trying to remember with one well-known American impressionist, but came back and was our star. She's remembered as Tennessee's greatest impressionist today, and I'm glad that we have several examples of her work here and also at the McClung Collection downtown. But anyway, she was right there, and but unfortunately for this whole flowering, we for other reasons we began having large-scale expositions in 1910. These were opportunities for these artists to bring their stuff out to a large public. These expositions held in Chilhowie Park. The Appalachian expositions of 1910 and 1911 had artistic exhibits, especially 1911 had several American impressionists, including Mary Cassatt and Robert. It's him, right? Yeah. And for years and years, I saw his name and just thought Henri. I think it was David who called him Henri, but he was a piece of this here in the exhibit as well because it's representative of the kind of stuff that Knoxvillians and people from around the region came to see. And then the great Conservation Exposition of 1913 was even bigger. And they had a whole fine arts pavilion, a beautiful place that was modeled after. It looked like the kind of building built in the Chicago Bulls Heritage times. But these were ways that local people had their first experience with real art. But at the same time this was happening, some things were coming apart. Ms. Audigier, her husband kind of offered a job in Rome, and she moved to Rome and spent the rest of her life there. Was fascinated to go to Europe, which she loved, and she loved she was a great fan of Impressionism. But when Cubism came along, she didn't know what to make of it. And at the age of 52, she saw her first Cubist paintings and said governments should be ashamed to allow this sort of thing in the public. So sooner that she said we should sooner allow madmen to run free in the streets than show this sort of thing. And of course today we allow madmen to run the streets too. So. But she spent the rest of her life in Rome and she was buried here at the very old Great Cemetery underneath a lovely stone made of Carrara marble, a sculpture of a woman, an angel, Madonna sort of figure. But as time went on, Lloyd Branson died in the 20s, and Catherine Wiley actually lost her mind right afterwards. I don't know if that was associated with it. She was very close to Lloyd Branson. She was institutionalized right after that, and it seemed like that all of those blows just knocked the wind out of art in Knoxville. But I think it's interesting how all these things are linked in a chain, and even in the most unlikely ways. I think one of Lloyd Branson's very last pupils was a very young black boy from East Knoxville named Buford Delaney. Who came and helped Lloyd Branson in his Gay Street studio, mixed paints and so forth, and I think we learned a great deal from him. And in fact, when he first went to study art in New York, Lloyd Ransom helped pay the bill for it. And Lloyd, of course, Buford Laney became one of the great modern artists of our area, and some people think one of the great black modern artists of the American 20th century. And I'm also glad there's a piece of his here as well, a self-portrait. You can't necessarily see direct connections through his art to Lloyd Ransom, but you know that biographically that there is this connection. Anyway, I've gone over time, but I feel like I've just scratched the surface. But I'll leave it up to you to learn more from, as you can learn much more from the gallery. So, thanks.